Margaret faced years of crushing loneliness and declining health, abandoned by time and overlooked by those she loved most. Even hope itself seemed to stand as her silent adversary, leaving her isolated and believing her life was over. But when a simple, forgotten remedy arrived, everything changed in a way no one expected. Stay tuned for the incredible twist that restored justice to her world, and why her journey proves hope is never truly lost. Margaret Chen sat in the worn armchair by the window. Her fingers traced the edges of a photograph she had touched 1,000 times before. Richard's smile looked back at her, frozen in a moment from their anniversary celebration 7 years ago. The glass frame felt cold against her palms, and she pulled it closer to her chest as another cough built in her throat. The coughing fit started slowly, just a tickle that turned into a harsh, rattling sound that shook her entire body. She doubled over, clutching the photograph carefully so it wouldn't slip from her grasp. When the coughing finally stopped, Margaret's eyes were watering, and her chest ached from the strain. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at Richard's face again. 5 years. It had been 5 years since pneumonia had taken him from her in just 3 terrible weeks. She remembered how his breathing had grown shallow, how he'd tried to hide his pain behind jokes and reassurances. The doctors had done everything they could, but Richard's lungs had simply given up. Now every time Margaret felt the burning in her chest and heard that awful cough escape her lips, she thought of him. She thought of those final days and wondered if her own body was beginning the same slow surrender. At 73, Margaret had stopped fighting, not dramatically, not with any grand declaration, but quietly, like a candle slowly burning down. She'd stopped taking her daily walks around the neighborhood. She'd stopped attending the book club she'd belonged to for 15 years. She'd stopped making appointments with her doctor, convincing herself that aches and pains were simply part of growing old. What was the point of prolonging the inevitable? The living room around her held memories in every corner. The couch where Richard used to fall asleep watching television. The bookshelf filled with novels they'd planned to read together in retirement. The empty space on the wall where his favorite painting had hung before Sarah had taken it to restore the frame. Everything reminded Margaret of what was gone, and nothing reminded her of what remained. Sarah used to visit every Sunday without fail, bringing her husband Tom and the grandchildren. The house would fill with noise and laughter, and for a few hours Margaret would remember what it felt like to be needed. But over the past year, those visits had become less frequent, every other Sunday, then once a month. Now it had been 6 weeks since Sarah had stopped by, and Margaret couldn't bring herself to call and ask why. She understood, of course. Sarah had her own life to manage. Her daughter worked full-time as a nurse at County General, and Tom's construction business demanded long hours. The kids had soccer practice, piano lessons, homework, and a social calendar that would exhaust anyone half their age. Margaret told herself it was selfish to expect them to spend their precious free time sitting with a sad old woman who had nothing interesting to say anymore. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. The silence in the house pressed against her like a physical weight. She'd started talking to Richard's photograph, telling him about her day as if he could hear her. She knew it was foolish, but it made her feel less alone. The cough had started about 6 weeks ago, just a small irritation in her throat that she'd blamed on the changing weather. Autumn had arrived early this year, bringing cold winds that rattled the windows and made the old house creak. But instead of improving, the cough had grown worse. It kept her awake at night, leaving her exhausted during the day. She tried over-the-counter medicines from the pharmacy, honey tea, even sleeping propped up on extra pillows, but nothing helped. Last night had been particularly bad. Margaret had barely slept 2 hours, waking repeatedly to coughing fits that left her gasping for air. This morning, she'd noticed her hands trembling when she tried to pour her coffee, and the simple act of getting dressed had left her breathless. She knew she should call her doctor, but the thought of explaining everything, of going through tests and prescriptions and follow-up appointments, felt overwhelming. Margaret was settling back into the chair, preparing for another long evening alone, when she heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, followed by a firm knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment she considered simply staying quiet and pretending she wasn't home. But the knock came again, more insistent this time, and she heard a familiar voice call out, "Margaret, it's Dorothy. I know you're in there, honey. I can see your living room light on." Margaret sighed and pushed herself up from the chair, her knees protesting the movement. She shuffled to the door and opened it to find Dorothy standing on the porch, her arms loaded with grocery bags that looked far too heavy for a woman of 63 to be carrying. Dorothy had moved in next door 8 years ago, shortly after her own husband passed away. Unlike Margaret, Dorothy had responded to grief by throwing herself into activity. She volunteered at the community center, took art classes at the local college, and seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. Her energy was both admirable and exhausting. "Dorothy, what are you doing here?" Margaret asked, stepping aside to let her neighbor enter. "I was at the store and picked up some extra things," Dorothy said, moving past Margaret into the kitchen. She set the bags down on the counter with a grunt of relief. "Thought I'd drop them by and check on you. I haven't seen you outside in days." Margaret followed her into the kitchen, suddenly self-conscious about the dishes piled in the sink and the trash that needed to be taken out. She'd been meaning to clean, but every task felt monumental lately. "I've been fine, just a little under the weather," Margaret said, but her words were cut off by another cough that left her gripping the counter for support. Dorothy turned sharply, her expression shifting from friendly concern to genuine alarm. She crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps and placed a hand on Margaret's back, supporting her until the coughing subsided. "Margaret, you sound terrible," Dorothy said, her voice firm but kind. "That's not just a little cold. Have you seen a doctor?" Margaret straightened up, pulling away from Dorothy's supporting hand. She felt embarrassed by her weakness, ashamed that someone had to witness her body's betrayal. "It's just a cough, Dorothy. At my age, everything hurts. My knees ache when it rains. My back complains when I stand too long. Now my lungs are joining the chorus. It's nothing worth bothering a doctor about." Dorothy crossed her arms, a gesture Margaret recognized as her neighbor's stubborn stance. Despite her arthritis, which had gnarled her fingers and made her movements sometimes stiff and painful, Dorothy still carried herself with a determination that Margaret envied. "That's nonsense and you know it," Dorothy said, shaking her head. "You're not ancient, Margaret. You're 73, not 93. My grandmother lived to be 97 and was still gardening the week before she passed. You don't have to just accept suffering as part of getting older." Margaret wanted to argue, but the truth was that she didn't have the energy for it. She leaned against the counter, feeling the exhaustion in every muscle. Dorothy watched her with eyes that saw too much, that recognized the resignation Margaret had been trying to hide from everyone, including herself. "Listen," Dorothy said, her tone softening. "My grandmother used to make this remedy when any of us kids got sick with coughs or chest colds. Honey and onion. I know it sounds strange, probably sounds like old-fashioned nonsense to you, but it worked miracles. Real miracles, Margaret." Margaret felt her automatic skepticism rising. She'd heard plenty of folk remedies in her life, most of them useless superstitions that people clung to because they were desperate or naive. Chicken soup for everything, garlic to ward off illness, herbs and potions that did nothing but waste time while real medicine could have helped. But as she looked at Dorothy, at the earnestness in her neighbor's weathered face, something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was simply that she was tired of feeling helpless. Tired of the constant hacking that rattled her ribs and kept her awake night after night. Whatever the reason, Margaret found herself asking the question instead of dismissing Dorothy's suggestion outright. "How do you make it?" The words came out quietly, almost reluctantly. Dorothy's entire face transformed, lighting up with a smile that erased years from her appearance. Without a word, she turned to the grocery bags and began pulling items out. An onion, large and golden brown. A jar of honey, the kind with the honeycomb still floating inside. A clean glass jar with a lid. "It's so simple," Dorothy said, her hands already working despite the way her knuckles were swollen and bent. "You slice the onion thin, like this." She pulled a knife from Margaret's drawer and began cutting the onion with practiced efficiency. Then you layer it in a jar with honey, alternating between onion slices and honey. You seal it up and let it sit overnight. The onion releases its juices, mixes with the honey, and creates this syrup. You take a spoonful whenever you need it. Margaret watched, fascinated despite herself, as Dorothy's skilled hands moved through the process. The onion slices fell in perfect translucent circles. The honey poured thick and golden, coating each layer. Dorothy worked methodically, explaining each step, and Margaret found herself memorizing the process even though she hadn't decided whether she would actually use the remedy. "There," Dorothy said finally. screwing the lid onto the jar and holding it up to the light. The onion slices floated in the honey like strange specimens in amber. Let this sit on your counter overnight. By morning, you'll see how the onion has released its liquid. That's when it's ready. She set the jar on Margaret's counter and wiped her hands on a dish towel. For a moment, they both stood there, looking at the strange mixture. Margaret felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that might have been hope, though she didn't want to name it. "Thank you, Dorothy," Margaret said quietly. "I don't know if it'll work, but thank you for trying." Dorothy reached out and squeezed Margaret's hand, her arthritic fingers surprisingly strong. "Give it a chance," she said. "Sometimes the old ways know things we've forgotten." After Dorothy left, Margaret stood alone in her kitchen, staring at the jar. It looked absurd sitting there on her counter, this folk remedy from another era. She imagined what Richard would say if he could see it. He'd probably laugh his warm, teasing laugh and ask if she was going to start reading tea leaves next. But Richard wasn't here to laugh. Richard wasn't here at all. Margaret picked up the jar, feeling its weight in her hands. She carried it to the living room and set it on the side table next to Richard's photograph. It seemed fitting somehow, placing this symbol of hope beside the reminder of her loss. The evening passed slowly. Margaret made herself a simple dinner that she barely touched. She tried to watch television but couldn't focus on any program. The jar sat in her peripheral vision, impossible to ignore. She felt foolish for even considering that something so simple could help her. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt curious about tomorrow. Night fell, and with it came the familiar dread. Margaret changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, knowing what was coming. Sure enough, within an hour the coughing started. It began as it always did, with a tickle that grew into an uncontrollable spasm. She sat up, gasping, her whole body convulsing with each cough. The fit went on and on, worse than usual, until Margaret was hunched over, tears streaming down her face, her ribs aching from the force of it. She couldn't catch her breath. Panic began to set in, the fear that maybe this time the coughing wouldn't stop, that maybe her body had finally reached its limit. When the fit finally subsided, Margaret sat in the darkness of her bedroom, shaking. Her throat felt raw, her chest burned, and she was so exhausted she wanted to simply lie down and never get up. But she also knew she couldn't endure another night like this. She couldn't continue to suffer in silence while her body slowly broke down. With trembling hands, Margaret threw back the covers and made her way downstairs. The house was dark except for the street light filtering through the windows. She found the jar on the side table and carried it to the kitchen, where she switched on the light. The onion had already begun to release its juices. The honey had thinned, turned syrupy, mixing with the sharp liquid from the onion slices. It looked strange and medicinal, nothing like any remedy she'd bought from a pharmacy. Margaret found a spoon and unscrewed the lid. The smell hit her immediately, sharp onion mixed with sweet honey, pungent and oddly comforting. She dipped the spoon into the mixture, watching the golden syrup coat the metal. For a moment she hesitated, feeling ridiculous. Then she brought the spoon to her lips and swallowed. The taste was unexpected. Sweet honey with a sharp, almost spicy bite from the onion. It coated her throat immediately, a warm, soothing sensation that spread through her chest. Margaret waited, spoon still in hand, expecting nothing to happen. But within a minute, maybe two, she realized the burning sensation in her throat had eased. The constant urge to cough, that awful tickle that had plagued her for weeks, had subsided. She could breathe more easily, as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. Margaret took another spoonful, then another. She stood in her kitchen at 2 a.m, tasting this strange remedy, and felt something she hadn't felt since Richard died. She felt relief. She carried the jar back upstairs and set it on her nightstand. She climbed into bed, settled against the pillows, and waited for the coughing to return. But it didn't. Her breathing remained steady. The tickle in her throat stayed quiet. And for the first time in weeks, Margaret Chen closed her eyes and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep that lasted until morning. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through her window, and for the first time in weeks, she had slept through the entire night. No coughing fits, no gasping for air. She sat up slowly, testing her lungs with a careful breath. The burning sensation had dulled to something manageable. She reached for the jar on her nightstand and took a spoonful of the honey-onion mixture. As the sweet and sharp taste coated her throat, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: possibility. Not just physical relief, but hope. She made herself breakfast, actually hungry for the first time in weeks. Then she picked up the phone and called Sarah. "Hello, Mom?" Sarah sounded surprised. "Sarah, it's me. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No, Mom, it's fine. Is everything okay?" "Everything's better than fine," Margaret said, and was surprised to find it was true. "Mom, you sound different. Your voice sounds stronger." "I do feel better. Dorothy brought me an old remedy yesterday. Honey and onion, of all things. I slept through the night for the first time in weeks." There was a pause. "That's wonderful, Mom. I'm so glad." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "Sarah, I've been thinking. I've spent 5 years waiting to join your father. I stopped living after he passed, but maybe that's not what he would have wanted. Richard loved life. He wouldn't have wanted me to spend my remaining years just waiting for them to end." Silence, then Sarah began crying. "Mom, I've been so worried about you. I've been so scared. Every time the phone rang, I thought it was going to be bad news. You seemed so far away, like you were already gone." "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't realize how my grief was affecting you." They talked for almost an hour, making plans for Sarah to visit on Sunday. Over the following weeks, Margaret established a new routine. Every morning and evening, she took the honey onion remedy. The cough diminished day by day, and with it, the fog of depression that had settled over her life. She cleaned her house thoroughly. She went through Richard's closet, something she'd been unable to face for 5 years, carefully packing his clothes to donate. The process was painful but liberating. Dorothy stopped by regularly with various excuses, but Margaret knew she was checking to make sure she was improving. One afternoon, Dorothy handed her a pamphlet for the senior center. "I've been trying to get you to come for months," Dorothy said. "They have a cooking class on Thursdays. How about it?" Margaret felt the familiar resistance, but pushed back against it. "I'll come. This Thursday." That Thursday, Margaret walked into the senior center for the first time in 5 years. The cooking class was warm and welcoming, and she found herself relaxing as she chopped vegetables and shared memories. At the end of class, Margaret mentioned the honey onion remedy to Dorothy. Several others gathered around, interested. "My granddaughter has been fighting a cough all month," one woman said. "I've had chest congestion for weeks," added another. Margaret offered to show them how to make it. The following Thursday, she came prepared with onions, honey, and jars. She demonstrated the technique, explaining each step. People tasted the mixture, and those suffering from coughs were immediately interested. "How long before you noticed a difference?" someone asked. "Within minutes, my throat felt better," Margaret said honestly. "By the next morning, I'd slept through the night." Word spread. People came back with success stories. Margaret became a regular at the senior center, joining the book club and exercise class. But the cooking class became her passion. One afternoon, 6 weeks after Dorothy had first brought her the ingredients, Margaret stood before the cooking class sharing her story. "My Richard used to say that healing comes in unexpected forms," Margaret began, her eyes misting. Dorothy sat in the back row, smiling. "I thought I knew what that meant, but I was wrong. Healing isn't just about the body. It's about remembering that you still have something to give, even when you think everything's been taken from you." She held up the jar. "When I lost Richard 5 years ago, I thought my life was over. This simple remedy gave me back my life. Not just because it cured my cough, but because it reminded me there are still small miracles. That there are still people who care. That there are still things I can do to help others." The class erupted in applause. That evening, as Margaret prepared a fresh batch of the remedy in her kitchen, she heard the front door open. "Grandma, we're here!" Her grandchildren burst into the kitchen, wrapping their arms around her waist. Sarah and Tom followed with grocery bags. "We thought we'd make dinner here tonight," Sarah said. "The kids have been asking to visit." Margaret looked around her kitchen, now filled with family after so long being empty. The house was loud and chaotic and full of life. She glanced at Richard's photograph on the mantel. With the evening light catching the glass, it looked like he was smiling at her with approval. "Mom, are you okay?" Sarah touched her arm. Margaret pulled her daughter into a hug. "I'm better than okay. I'm grateful." The pain of losing Richard would never completely disappear, but she had found a way to live alongside it. The simple act of caring for her health had opened a door she thought had closed forever. After dinner, after the kids left, Margaret took a spoonful of the honey onion remedy, savoring the taste that had given her back her life. She thought about the people at the senior center making their own batches. She thought about Dorothy's kindness. She thought about Sarah's relief. She thought about her grandchildren's laughter. Margaret understood now that grief didn't require her to stop living. It required her to find new reasons to continue. And in helping others discover the same remedy that had helped her, she had found her purpose again. She smiled at Richard's photograph and prepared for bed. Tomorrow she would teach another class. Tomorrow she would continue living, fully and gratefully, in ways that would have made Richard proud. But tonight, she would sleep peacefully, breathing easily, knowing she had found her way back to the light.